Jung split with Freud on the issue of the Oedipal story as the fundamental myth of humankind, and on the issue of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And Jung came down heavily on the side of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And he established that in a book called Symbols of Transformation, which was written in 1914. And that's the book that produced the permanent split with Freud. And that book, I would say that book's actually been written 3 times. It was written as four times, written as Symbols of Transformation, which Jung extensively revised when he was old. And then it was rewritten, in a sense, by a student of Jung's called Erich Neumann, who's also someone I would really recommend. Erich Neumann, I think, is Jung's greatest student. And he wrote 2 books. He wrote one called The Origins and History of Consciousness, which is a description of the development of consciousness out of unconsciousness, using the hero myth as an interpretive skeleton. So Neumann viewed the hero myth as the dramatized story of the emergence of human consciousness out of the surrounding unconsciousness in which it was embedded. The struggle of consciousness upward towards the light, like a lotus flower struggles up through the muck and the water to lay itself on the surface of the water and bloom and reveal the Buddha, which is, of course, what the lotus flower does from a symbolic perspective. And for Neumann, the hero's story was the story of the successful development of consciousness. And The Origins of Consciousness, The Origins and History of Consciousness is a great book. Interestingly, Camille Paglia read The Origins and History of Consciousness. She's one of the few mainstream intellectuals that I've ever encountered who read that and commented on it. And she believed that it would be sufficient antidote to postmodern denigration of literature. She thought it was that powerful a work, and I believe that. I think it's a remarkable book. Carl Jung wrote the foreword to that book, and he said in the foreword that it was the book that he wished he would have written. So it's sort of like Jung, he wrote, I don't remember how many volumes, dozens of very thick, difficult volumes. It was like Neumann was able to distill those into a single volume statement. And so I would also say, if you're interested in Jung, the best book to read is The Origins and History of Consciousness. It's the best intro into the Jungian world. So Jung's very difficult to understand. It requires a real shift of perspective in order to understand what he's talking about. And Neumann wrote another book called The Great Mother, which is a little bit more specialized in some sense, but it's also extremely interesting because it fleshes out the archetype of chaos and its representation as feminine. It's a brilliant book as well, and highly worth reading, both those books. Anyways, Jung was a very strange person and a visionary, and so that's kept him outside of the academic realm almost entirely. I mean, I was constantly warned as an undergraduate and then a graduate student and then a professor against ever talking about Jung in any way whatsoever. When I went on the job market, when I was at McGill, when I had graduated from McGill, I had done my scientific research on alcoholism, and I had a fairly lengthy publication record that was pure empirical research and really neurophysiological research into the pharmacology of alcoholism. And I'd established a reasonably solid dossier of publications, but at the same time I was writing this book that became Maps of Meaning, and so I'd split my time in graduate student school between these 2 endeavors, one very specifically neurological and pharmacological and really biologically based, and the other very abstract, religious, symbolic, psychoanalytic, the complete opposite. But I could see that the 2 things overlapped really nicely, and there was a number of scientists at the time that were also drawing the same conclusions, the same relationship between the biology and the psychoanalysis. Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which is a great classic, is one of those people who saw the relationship between the neurobiology of emotion and motivation and the psychoanalytic insights. never became a mainstream view, but I think it's too complex. I think that bridging the gap between the biology and the symbolic is too much for people, generally speaking. You know, it was certainly virtually too much for me because I got quite ill when I was a graduate student, I think, for a variety of reasons. I also would go out and party 3 nights a week, and so that probably had something to do with it. But working on those two things simultaneously was